So for this Dharma talk, which is the 2nd of July 2006, we'll take up a case in the Blue Cliff Record. This is case 96. It's getting near the end. There's 100 cases in the Blue Cliff. And it's Zhao Zhou's 3 turning words. It's a short case. It goes like this. Zhao Zhou expressed 3 turning words to his community. A clay Buddha does not pass through water. A metal Buddha does not pass through a furnace. A wooden Buddha does not pass through fire. That's it. We've had other Dhamma talks and teishos on Zhao Zhou because he's such a wonderful teacher, such a great master. Just a little recap on his life. He lived in the Tang dynasty, the golden age of Zen, and he lived for 120 years, they say. And his dates are 778 to 897, so just under 120 years. He was born in northern China, and his surname was Ho. And the first record of his life is when he came to meet Master Nanchuan when he was 17. And he stayed as a student and disciple of Nanchuan for 40 years. Now, Zhao Zhou is a real favorite of many people, many Zen students. The great Zen master Dogen in Japan used to refer to him as the old Buddha. And he was old. Sensei and I visited Zhao Zhou's temple, Bailan Si, back in 2001. It had been rebuilt and was is a flourishing Zen monastery now. Since then, since 2001, we've heard reports through Andy Ferguson, who takes Zen tours to China, that Bailan Si, Zhao Zhou's temple, is becoming an international center. More Zen students from the West are training with the current abbot there. And so this is great. It's when you work on koans, on Zhao Zhou's koans, you really get the sense of a living presence. He's, in some respects, he's still right here, still teaching. So it's great to know that that his center is active again. It fell into, the temple itself fell into great disrepair during the Cultural Revolution, but now it's thriving. Just want to have a look at a few little dialogues between Zhao Zhou and some of his students. These are ones that really pertain to our case. The first one is, a monk asked, "What about it when all the bones are pulverized and there is one everlasting spirit?" Zhao Zhou said, "It's windy again this morning." Windy again this morning. This morning there was a frost on the grass outside 100 Power Road. This monk asks a sort of fairly lofty question. What about it when all the bones are pulverized and there's this one everlasting spirit? And Zhao Zhou just brings him down to earth. Forget about the one everlasting spirit, whatever that is. It's windy again this morning. The wind's blowing. We'll come back to this wind later on in the talk, but just so much better than to think of getting caught up in concepts of one everlasting spirit or God or whatever, just to get buffeted about by the wind. Another dialogue. Zhao Zhou was asked by a monk, "Who is Buddha?" "The one in the shrine," came the answer. "Isn't it a clay statue that sits in the shrine?" the monk went on. "Yes, that's right," said Zhao Zhou. Then who is Buddha? The monk repeated. The one in the shrine, answered Zhao. He was right. That's the Buddha figures in the shrine. This monk was obviously wanting to test Zhao with his questions. Who is Buddha? But in that question there was a sort of fixating on Buddha being something separate from the person asking the question. And Zhao goes along with that. Okay, you want to objectify Buddha? It's the one in the shrine. Brings the monk back to a reality, brings him back to earth. This is again comes out in another dialogue, very similar. A monk asked, "What is the way?" Zhao said, "That which lies beyond the fence." The monk said, "That's not what I'm talking about." Zhao said, "Which way were you talking about?" The monk said, "The great way." Zhao said, "The great way leads to the capital." Okay, it's an actual path. It's probably the Tokaido, the great way that went from Kyoto to Edo, perhaps. No, that would be right. No, it would be Chang'an, the great way in China that led to the capital of China at that time, Chang'an. It's a real road that you had to walk on step by step, a road that carts and donkeys and horses would go down. And if you're on foot, you'd get dusty and you'd get thirsty. That's the road. That's the important road, the one that you have to walk, not some theoretical great way. And again, so this is Joshu's teaching. It's very earthy, very down to earth. It's said that after he left his master, after his master died, Nanshuan, Zhao was about 60 at the time. He spent 20 years on pilgrimage, visiting other teachers, sharpening his understanding, deepening his understanding. And it was only when he was 80 that he finally settled down at a temple and began to teach. And he taught for nearly 40 years. So he relied, because he began teaching, really teaching when he was 80, he relied on his great wisdom to come forth, not in shouts or physical actions like other Zen teachers, but just in words, just to say the appropriate word to the student, to open the student up. And it's said that a golden light used to play around his lips when he spoke. One more story before we get on to the koan itself. This is back in the time when he was working with Nanshuan, and he was the fire stoker in the monastery's kitchen. And one day, Zhao barred the kitchen door from the inside and started a fire. In a short time, the room was filled with smoke and flames. And then he cried out, "Fire! Fire! Help! Help!" All the monks immediately gathered outside, but they could not get in because the door was locked. Then Zhao said, "Say the right word, and I will open the door. Otherwise, I won't." And nobody could give an answer. All the monks just stood outside the door. Probably smoke was coming under the door and drifting out to the corridor. But no one could give a good response. And then the master, Nanshuan, came along and he handed a key to Zhao through a small side window. And Zhao opened the door himself. That was what he'd been waiting for. That was the appropriate word. In this case, it was an appropriate action. And that brings us to the case. Zhao had 3 turning words. Now, a turning word in Zen can be a word or a phrase given by a teacher that can open up the mind of whoever asked the question and can lead to an awakening. A turning word can be a shout. It can be just one word. It can be moo. Or it can be a phrase. It can be an action. A blow of the stick. Anything that precipitates an awakening experience is a turning word. One definition is turning words are words that turn over the mind of illusion and open the mind to enlightenment. This turning over, or revolution if you like, is important. And because not only do we have turning words that can trigger enlightenment experience, awakening experience, but awakening itself is a turning over in the deepest layers of the mind. In the Lankavatara Sutra, one of the great Mahayana sutras, goes into this in considerable depth. It's one of the prime Mahayana sutras that really sets forth Buddhist psychology. I'll just read one passage. We haven't got time to get into this in depth, but I'll just read one passage from the Lankavatara Sutra. To attain nirvana, which is the state of emptiness, shunyata, inherent in the nature of things, and which is a state of self-realization obtained by means of supreme wisdom, there must be a revolution, which in Sanskrit is paravriti. There must be a revolution at the deepest seat of consciousness, known as the alaya vijnana. The latter is a kind of mental receptacle where all the memories of one's past deeds and psychic activities is deposited and preserved in a form of energy called vasana, or in Chinese, siqi, which means habit energy. Okay, so the important point is that in this deepest level of consciousness, when awakening happens, there's a revolution, a paravriti. D.T. Suzuki, who translated the Lankavatara Sutra, goes on. He gives a little sort of definition of paravriti. It literally means turning up or turning back or change. Technically, it is a spiritual change or transformation which takes place in the mind. In Buddhism, there's consciousness. We talk about 8 consciousness or levels of consciousness. The first 6 consciousnesses are the 5 senses, eye consciousness, air consciousness, and so forth. And then the 6th one is mind consciousness. In Buddhism, mind is the 6th sense. And then after these 6, there is the manas, the 7th consciousness, which is sort of like an electrical current that connects the first 6 consciousnesses, which form the ego identity, with the 8th consciousness, which is the vast storehouse consciousness, which is the alaya vijnana. The alaya vijnana, this 8th consciousness, is a bit like Jung's collective unconsciousness. It's the repository of everything that we've ever perceived through all the other senses, and it's the repository of everything from time immemorial as far as mind goes. Thich Nhat Hanh, and in regard to this 8th consciousness, he says, our mind is a field in which every kind of seed is sown, seeds of compassion, joy and hope, seeds of sorrow, fear and difficulties. Every day our thoughts, words and deeds plant new seeds in the field of our store consciousness, and what these seeds generate become the substance of our life. So all our habits, all our ways of reacting to the world Their root is in the eighth consciousness, and stuff from the eighth consciousness via the manas, the seventh consciousness, is conveyed up into our ego consciousnesses, and stuff that we perceive in the day via the manas goes right back down into the eighth consciousness. And so this awakening experience is a real turning around in the alaya vijnana. But having said that, and again we can't go, haven't got time to go into it in detail, it's very complicated and at the base mysterious. There's a Zen capping phrase that says, mind revolves along with myriad phenomena. The turning point is truly mysterious. But to help us open the mind, Zhaozhou has given these three turning words. A clay Buddha does not pass through water. A wooden Buddha does not pass through fire. And a metal Buddha does not pass through a furnace. Just want to talk a little bit about Buddha figures, the importance of Buddha figures. Behind us on the altar, we had our Jukai ceremony last week. There's a standing Buddha figure, a Thai figure, which is, it's got a real quality of lightness to it, of noble lightness. And this is, Buddha figures are important, of course, in Buddhism, for their devotional aspects. It's great to have an inspiring figure on the altar, or in the Zendo or in the Buddha hall, or wherever people come together to chant or to practice. And in Zen, we always stress that Buddha figures are just a reminder of our true nature. They're not separate from us at all. So when we enter a Zendo and bow to the Buddha figure or the figure of a bodhisattva, we're acknowledging our innate, perfect enlightenment. This is what we're here to realize. Just as if there's the figure of Manjusri, the bodhisattva of wisdom, when we bow to Manjusri, we're bowing to our innate wisdom. Just as when we bow to a figure of Guanyin, Kanon, we're bowing to our innate compassion. And with that bow, there's also a sense that we're vowing to realize that compassion or wisdom. Roshi Kapleau always stressed that it's good to refer to Buddha figures as figures, not statues. If we call them statues, then sort of statue is something you place in a museum or an art gallery. Figure, to say Buddha figure figure conveys the human aspect. It's just a better way of linking that figure with ourselves. So, from a Zen perspective, when we bow, we're not separate from whatever the figure is we're bowing to. However, in Asian Buddhism, devotion plays a very, very strong part. And often people pray to Buddha figures, they do many prostrations to Buddha figures. And the time when Zhaozhou was teaching, in China and Japan, it was seen that you could become attached to a Buddha figure. You could see Buddhism, you could see the Buddha as something separate, something very lofty, something you could never attain to, but you could only worship. And so there are many stories to shake a person out of that too devotional mindset. One very famous one is Danxia Tianran, a teacher. His dates are 739 to 824. One day he was staying at Wisdom Wood Temple when the weather became bitterly cold, and so he took a wooden statue of the Buddha and burned it in the fire to keep warm. The temple director got extremely upset with Tianran and yelled, "Why are you burning my wooden Buddha?" Tianran pulled some burning embers from the fire and said, "I'm burning this Buddha to get the sacred I'm burning this Buddha to get the sacred relics from it." Okay, these sacred relics are sarira, which it's said to be these little sort of stones, mineral posits that are left behind when a master or a Buddha or someone of high attainment, when he or she dies, these little stones are left behind and they're collected. This is a practice that goes on in Korea especially, and also I think in Japan to this day. So Tianran says, "I'm burning this Buddha to get the sacred relics from it." And the temple director said, "How can a wooden Buddha have sacred relics?" And Tianran said, "Well, if it doesn't have sacred relics, let's burn a couple more of them." At that point, the temple director was so upset his eyebrows and eyelashes and beard all fell out at once. Okay, so clearly that the temple director was too attached to the Buddha figure, and that's what it boils down to. No matter how beautiful the figures are, inspirational, it's important not to get attached to them. The true Buddha is within. However, there's something wonderfully iconoclastic about this story. Okay, so going to our koan, the three turning words. A clay Buddha does not pass through water, a metal Buddha does not pass through a furnace, a wooden Buddha does not pass through fire. First, a clay Buddha does not pass through water. There's a technique, an ancient technique in China for making Buddha figures using clay and straw. And then once the Buddha figure is formed with the clay and straw, it's covered in a sort of a very subtle papier-mâché technique. And there's a guy I know, Tomasz, who was a member of he's a Polish guy, he's an artist, member of the Sweden Sangha, and several years ago he went to America to work with a Chinese teacher at the Temple of 1,000 Buddhas in California. And while he was there, he was shown this ancient technique of making clay Buddhas from straw and clay. And he made a beautiful Manjushri figure, the Bodhisattva of Wisdom, for the Stockholm Zen Center. So if ever you go to Stockholm, you'll probably come across that Manjushri figure. Okay, so a clay Buddha dissolves in water, and the water breaks apart what is solid and unyielding. You can just imagine the sort of the clay Buddha being worked through the pressure of water, just breaking apart and dissolving and being carried away. And in another Mahayana Sutra, the Sarangama Sutra, says this about water. Water is yielding but all-conquering. It never attacks, but always wins the last battle. All of these three turning words point to the impermanence of all things, the impermanence of this body, of Buddha figures, of everything. Everything is in flux. Everything changes and passes away. And water is really a prime image of impermanence. There's a beautiful passage from record of a 10-foot square hut by a Japanese writer, Kamo no Chomei. And it goes like this. The river flows on unceasingly, but the water is never the same as before. Bubbles that bob on the surface of the still places disappear one moment, to reappear again the next, but they seldom endure for long. And so it is with people of this world and the houses they live in. We think of those images of houses being carried away in the floods. The next image of impermanence. A metal Buddha does not pass through a furnace. On the altar of the Rochester Zen Center, the Arnold Park Center, there's a very beautiful, mysterious metal Buddha. It's the healing Buddha, and he has a bowl in his right hand with the medicine of the Dharma that he dispenses. And this is when we clean this Buddha once a year during the New Year celebrations. This Buddha is taken down from the altar. It's not a very big figure, but when you take him down from the altar, it takes two people sometimes. He's very, very heavy. But even this metal Buddha has to pass through the fire, through the furnace. It's a great image, this image of the furnace, because what is melted down can be used again. Say a Buddha that's melted down, it can be fashioned into many different forms afterwards. And this really points to the bodhisattvic spirit of Zen, that always we have to melt down our own self-partiality so that we can be truly of benefit to others and of benefit to the world. This is part of Zen practice, to melt down that hard ball of ego that each one of us has, and to some degree to melt that down so our hearts become more tender and more open. That's the path of the bodhisattva. Sometimes this melting takes great heat and fire, and Zen Master Wumen said, "If you wish to know pure gold, see it in the midst of fire." And finally, a wooden Buddha does not pass through fire. There are many fine Buddha figures made of wood and varnished, and wooden figures. I think of Manjushri, the figure that we usually have on our altar, wooden figure sitting on his lion. Beautiful figures like that, when they're varnished, they seem to glow with their own light. And over the years, such a figure absorbs the concentrated energy of a zendo and radiates it back, inspiring our practice. But then again, but also wooden Buddhas eventually have to pass through fire too. It's good just to thinking about wooden Buddhas passing through fire, not to become attached to any of our supposed achievements in Zen practice, or at the same time, not to be attached to our innumerable failures in practice. When we fall down, all of us fall down in practice all the time. We have to pick ourselves back up and return to the breath or the koan. It's not getting stuck. That's the important thing, is not to get stuck in what's happened in the past, but just to give ourselves wholeheartedly to the task at hand, to whatever's required of us. And in a one-day sitting, it's to give ourselves wholeheartedly to our practice during this one day. Shunryu Suzuki, the founder of the San Francisco Zen Center, he said this, he sums this up really well when he says, "When you do something, you should burn yourself up completely, like a good bonfire, leaving no trace of yourself." Leaving no trace of yourself. A wooden Buddha does not pass through fire. Completely burnt up, doing what it has to do. Now, the question arises with this koan that why does Jiao Zhou repeat the same basic message of impermanence 3 times? Well, we can say that the practice of Zen is a refining process. It's the refining of our character. And this refining process involves the dissolving and melting down of our ego, and it never stops. It's particularly true of doing a 7-day sesshin. With each 7-day sesshin, after we come out of sesshin and everything's so bright and light, it's like a little bit of our iron cladding has been shed. We feel a little bit more free and open to the world. This is why doing sesshin is so important. It's a shedding. Each sesshin, to some degree, is a shedding of our carapace, the layer of our protective covering or armor that each one of us has. Little by little we shed this and we realize there's really nothing to defend. Everything's open. That hard ball of ego begins to soften and softens more with each sesshin. That's why in Zen, going to sesshin is, that's why we stress it. That's why, because in sesshin, transformations really begin to take place. Sesshin is like a furnace, or like a river, or like the fire. It's the place of transformation. In old times, retreats, especially 7-day retreats, were called Buddha sorting houses. The Buddhas get sorted. Also, I think this is an important point too, is there's a real psychological aspect to these clay Buddhas and wooden Buddhas and metal Buddhas. That Jiao has chosen 3 different materials. And there's an acknowledgement here that people who come to practice have different temperaments and characters. And this is vividly brought home for any of us who spend time at a Zen center or a Zen temple. If we work with a group of people, it's just amazing, just all the different types of people you meet. Everyone unique, coming from all sorts of different backgrounds, and if it's like the Rochester Zen Center, different countries, Mexico, Sweden, Poland, New Zealand, America, Canada, people from working class backgrounds, people who have done many years in university, tradespeople, teachers, lawyers, even judges. All is mixed up together, and all sorts of different quirks and tics and ways of approaching life and practice. Some people are very soft and malleable. Some people are very retiring, and others first can, when you meet them, appear very stiff and unbending. But this is really from an outside. Someone might appear to you like a spiritual warrior, clad in armor. While another person, when you first meet them, they may seem so shy that they wouldn't say boo to a goose. But you realize after a while that these are just surface appearances and they can be deceiving. Everyone who sincerely engages in Zen practice, that's the main thing. It's the perfecting of character. And this is different, and this process is different for everyone. But whether we're introverted or extroverted, whether we're soft and watery or hard and wooden, this process of dissolving, of loosening up, of letting go, has to take place. Its most important thing is this tenderizing process of Zazen, this letting go of what we cling to, just letting go, shedding all the time. Let's take the most extreme image that Jiao uses of the iron Buddha. Someone with an iron nature may be very sure of himself, even completely confident in all situations. Still, if that person sincerely wants to practice, then even that iron nature will have to go into the furnace and be melted down. Roshi Kapleau said, "To acknowledge one's limitations is hard for someone with a big ego. And the greatest limitation is to see ourselves as separate from others. That's what we have to melt down, our sense of separation. For some people, it can be a sense of our uniqueness. I'm special. I'm going to excel in this practice. I'm going to do really well in this practice." That has to be melted down. Other people, it can be a sense of inferiority, a negative ego. Oh, I'm no good at this. Everyone else is getting it. Everyone else is forging ahead in their practice, but I can't do this. It's beyond me. That negative ego has to be melted down as well, washed away, handed over to the flames. Just the process of loosening up or letting go. That's what's important. That's what's important. Finally, the initial compiler of this collection, the Blue Cliff Record, has 3 verses to go with the 3 elements. And so we'll have a look at Shwedo's 3 verses. A clay Buddha does not pass through water. Spiritual light illuminates heaven and earth. If standing in the snow were not stopped, who would not carve an imitation? If standing in the snow were not stopped, who would not carve an imitation? Now, spiritual light is the personal name of Hui Ke, the second ancestor of Zen. When Hui Ke was born, it said a spiritual light illuminated the room, extending into the sky. And this line, if standing in the snow were not stopped, who would not carve an imitation? It refers to a story, famous story, about Hui Ke meeting the first ancestor of Zen, Bodhidharma. And I'll just read the story. Many of you will know it. So Hui Ke, as a disciple, heard about Bodhidharma and decided to ask him for instruction. So he went all the way to Shaolin Temple and stood outside Bodhidharma's cave. Bodhidharma was meditating in a cave at the time, day and night, seeking instruction. But Bodhidharma would not even acknowledge Hui Ke's presence. He just kept on sitting. And Hui Ke thought to himself, when people of ancient times sought the way, they broke their bones and took out the marrow, shed their blood to appease hunger, spread out their hair to cover mud, threw themselves off cliffs to feed tigers. Even of old were they like this. What about me? That year, on the 9th of December, there was a great snow. Hui Ke stood by the wall. By dawn, snow had piled up past his knees. Bodhidharma took pity on him and said, "You, standing in the snow there, what do you seek?" Hui Ke sighed and said, I only beg your compassion to open the gates of ambrosia and save all creatures." Bodhidharma said, "The wondrous path of all the Buddhas requires zealous work over vast eons, practicing what is difficult to practice, enduring the endurable. With little virtue and petty knowledge, a shallow heart and arrogant mind, how can you seek to be a true vehicle? There is no way." Hui Ke, hearing this admonition, was even more earnest towards the path. He secretly took a sharp knife and cut off his own forearm and placed it before Bodhidharma. Bodhidharma knew he was a vessel of the Dharma, so he asked him, "You stand in the snow and cut off your arm. What for?" Hui Ke said, "My mind is not yet at peace. Please, Master, ease my mind." Bodhidharma said, "Bring forth your mind, and I will ease it." Hui Ke said, "When I search for my mind, ultimately, I can't find it." Bodhidharma said, "I have put your mind at ease." At that point, Hui Ke had a great awakening. That was the point. The point of this story is not so much the dramatic image of Hui Ke presenting his arm, but of his awakening, of Bodhidharma putting his mind at ease. He unblocked Hui Ke. He gave him the turning words that Hui Ke needed to hear. That's why the importance of, if standing in the snow were not stopped, who would not carve an imitation? There's a danger if Hui Ke just stood in the snow and became heroic without becoming enlightened. People of later times would take his standing in the snow as an example of austerity, of great austerity, and try and copy him and get nowhere, just as Shakyamuni, before his great enlightenment, got nowhere at the end of 6 years of great austerity. That's not the point. The point is becoming liberated, flowing with everything, becoming unblocked. Second verse. A metal Buddha does not pass through a furnace. Someone comes calling on Zihu. Several words are on the sign. Where is there no pure wind? Now, these verses of Shwedo's, they're just opportunities to tell stories and to link other stories in with the case at hand. So, this guy, Zihu, was a disciple of Master Nanchuan, Zhaozhou's teacher. And it said, Master Zihu set up a sign outside his gate. On the sign were words saying, Zihu has a dog. Above, he takes people's heads. In the middle, he takes people's loins. Below, he takes people's legs. If you stop to talk to him, you'll lose your body and your life. Whenever he saw a newcomer, Zihu would immediately shout, Watch out for the dog. Okay, so again, this is pointing, a metal Buddha does not pass through a furnace. This dog is just a metaphor. Again, these are all just metaphors. It's a metaphor of dying the great death and coming back to life again. Dying the great death is seeing into our true nature, dying to our confined, narrow, limited ego nature, and coming back to life awakened. This awakening is summed up in, where is there no pure wind? The pure wind abides nowhere. It's always moving, always fresh. You can't pin it down. You can't fix it. It's invisible, but it has great force. Its wind's always present. It can really animate us, can fill us. Our breath connects us with this great wind. And finally, the third verse, Shwedo's third verse. A wooden Buddha does not pass through fire. I always think of the oven breaker. Only when his staff suddenly struck was the true self liberated. And again, this hooks into another story. So our last story. Back in ancient times, there was the oven breaker monk of Mount Sung. We don't know anything else about him. He just dwelt in seclusion. One day, leading a group of followers, he went among the mountain aborigines, native dwellers of China at that point. They had a shrine which was most sacred. In its hall was placed only an oven. People from far and near sacrificed to it unceasingly. They had immolated many living creatures. The master entered the shrine and tapped the oven 3 times with his staff. He said, What humbug! You were originally made of brick and mud compounded. Where does the spirit come from? Whence does this sanctity originate, that you burn living creatures to death like this? Once again he hit it 3 times. The oven then toppled over, broke and collapsed. Momentarily, there was a man in a blue robe and tall hat suddenly standing in front of the master. Bowing, he said, "I am the god of the oven. For a long time I have been subject to retribution for actions, but today, hearing the master explain the truth of non-origination, I am already freed from this place and living in heaven. I have come especially to offer thanks." The master said, "It is your fundamentally inherent nature, not my force saying so." The god again bowed and disappeared. An attendant said, "I and the others have been around the master for a long time, but have never received instruction. What shortcut did the oven god find that he was immediately born in heaven?" The master said, "I just said to him, 'You were originally made of brick and mud put together. Where does the spirit come from? Whence does this sanctity emerge?'" The attendant made no reply. The master said, "Do you understand?" The monk said, "I do not understand." The master said, "Bow." The monk bowed. The master said, "Broken, collapsed." And the attendant was suddenly enlightened. Broken, collapsed. Those were the turning words. So the oven breaker liberated not only the spirit of the oven, but the monk as well. The spirit of the oven was released from its fixedness, from the dead rituals that had been performed at that place. The monk was freed from his fixed notions of the teachings, or what a teacher was, or whatever. He was unglued as well, unfixed, liberated. That's what all the examples that we looked at in this koan, all the metaphors are pointing to letting go, to flowing along, to melting down, to burning up, whatever it takes. Just metaphors and images are important in Zen. They're fingers pointing to the moon, which of course is itself metaphor. It's not the moon itself, but they can inspire us in our practice. So, in a talk like this, if you feel you're a wooden Buddha, use that metaphor. If you feel like you're more of a clay Buddha or a watery Buddha, work with that. If you feel like you're an iron Buddha, work with that. Whatever. We'll stop now and recite the 4 vows.